For many modern readers, the word angel immediately evokes an image shaped by Renaissance art and popular culture. A calm human figure, softened features, white robes, and a reassuring presence. This expectation is so deeply embedded that it often goes unquestioned. Yet when the earliest biblical texts are examined carefully, stripped of later artistic and theological filters, a profoundly different picture emerges, one that unsettles rather than comforts. In the oldest layers of Scripture, angels do not exist to affirm human emotions or provide gentle guidance. They appear rarely, briefly, and almost always at moments of extreme tension. Their arrival interrupts the natural order. Human characters do not greet them with curiosity or gratitude, but with fear, physical collapse, or silence. These reactions are not literary exaggerations. They are consistent, patterned responses preserved across multiple textual traditions. Within the Hebrew Bible, the term commonly translated as angel originates from a word meaning messenger. This definition, however, should not be misunderstood as implying familiarity or approachability. In the ancient Near Eastern world, a messenger of a king was not a friendly intermediary, but an extension of sovereign authority. To encounter such a figure was to confront power itself, not merely information. Biblical angels function in precisely this way. They carry the weight of divine command, not personal warmth. Early narratives emphasize this imbalance of power with remarkable restraint. Angels do not announce themselves with spectacle. Often they appear suddenly without warning, their identity recognized only after the fact. When recognition occurs, fear follows immediately. Patriarchs fall to the ground. Prophets lose the ability to speak. Warriors freeze. The text records these responses without commentary, assuming the reader understands that terror is the appropriate reaction. Crucially, angels in these accounts are not moral teachers. They do not explain theology or ethics. Their role is functional and often severe. They deliver judgments, initiate destruction, block passage, or mark boundaries that humans are forbidden to cross. Comfort, when it appears, is secondary and minimal, usually expressed only to prevent death from shock rather than to soothe emotion. As biblical literature develops, especially during periods of exile and political collapse, angelic roles become more defined and more unsettling. Angels are no longer isolated messengers, but members of structured celestial systems. They appear as watchers, guardians, destroyers, and executors of decrees that affect entire populations. This reflects a broader ancient worldview, in which the cosmos itself was governed by layered authorities, many of which were indifferent or hostile to human vulnerability. It is within this context that the terror associated with angels must be understood. Their fearfulness does not stem from cruelty or malice, but from scale. They represent forces operating beyond human limits, beings that do not negotiate, hesitate, or empathize. To encounter such a being is to realize instantly how small and exposed humanity truly is. This understanding challenges the modern assumption that angels exist primarily for human benefit. In the biblical record, they exist for divine order. Humans encounter them only incidentally, often at great personal cost. The terror recorded in these encounters is not a failure of faith, but an accurate response to an overwhelming reality. As the narrative evidence unfolds, it becomes clear that the most frightening aspect of biblical angels is not their appearance alone, but their purpose. They do not arrive to make humanity feel safe. They arrive because something irreversible is about to happen. In the Hebrew Bible, angelic appearances are closely tied to moments of rupture, events in which the normal flow of history is interrupted by decisive divine action. These beings emerge at thresholds, between life and death, covenant and punishment, order and collapse. Their function is not to accompany human life, but to intervene when it has reached a point of irreversible consequence. One of the most striking patterns in early biblical narratives is that angels are rarely individualized. They are not introduced with names, personalities, or detailed origins. Instead, they appear as instruments. This anonymity intensifies their terror. A named figure can be negotiated with, remembered, or mythologized. An unnamed agent of divine will cannot. The text presents them as forces rather than characters. In several narratives, angels are indistinguishable from the divine presence itself until the moment has passed. Only afterward do human witnesses realize they have survived an encounter with something non-human. This delayed recognition suggests that angelic beings were understood as operating just beyond the limits of perception, visible, yet not fully comprehensible. The fear that follows is retrospective, rooted in the realization of vulnerability rather than immediate threat. When angels do speak, their words are sparse and authoritative. There is no dialogue in the modern sense, no exchange of questions and reassurance. Commands are issued, outcomes are declared, silence follows. This rhetorical economy reinforces the imbalance of power and underscores that these beings are not participants in human drama, but enforcers of a higher order. Violence, when associated with angels, is often indirect but absolute. Entire cities are destroyed overnight. Armies collapse without visible combat. Plagues advance without human agency. The texts attribute these outcomes to angelic action without dwelling on mechanics, suggesting that the ancient authors viewed such events as self-evident expressions of divine enforcement rather than spectacles requiring explanation. Importantly, terror in these passages is not portrayed as moral failure. Fear does not indicate disbelief or rebellion. On the contrary, those who fear most deeply are often depicted as the most perceptive. They recognize that angelic presence signals proximity to judgment or transformation. Calmness, in contrast, is never presented as virtue in these encounters. This portrayal aligns with broader ancient Near Eastern conceptions of divine messengers. In surrounding cultures, emissaries of the gods were feared precisely because they carried irrevocable decrees. The biblical texts reflect this cultural environment while adapting it to a monotheistic framework, concentrating ultimate authority into a single divine source and its agents. Thus, angels in the Hebrew Bible are terrifying not because they are chaotic or evil, but because they embody inevitability. Once they appear, events unfold according to decree rather than choice. Human agency diminishes, and history moves forward with relentless clarity. As biblical literature moves from narrative history into prophetic and visionary texts, angels begin to appear not merely as isolated messengers, but as members of structured celestial orders. This shift is significant. Terror no longer arises only from sudden encounter, but from the realization that these beings belong to an organized system operating continuously beyond human awareness. Prophetic visions introduce angels as attendants, guards, and executors within a larger divine court. They stand, move, and act according to rank and function, rather than personal initiative. This imagery mirrors ancient Near Eastern royal courts, where authority flowed through rigid hierarchies and obedience was absolute. To encounter such a system was to confront power that was institutional, not negotiable. In these visions, angels are often associated with specific domains: fire, wind, destruction, or surveillance. Their roles are narrowly defined, and their actions are precise. This specialization intensifies their fearfulness. A being created solely to destroy, observe, or enforce is not tempered by human emotion. It exists to fulfill function, not to interpret circumstance. Descriptions of angelic movement further reinforce their inhuman nature. They do not walk, hesitate, or turn as humans do. They move suddenly, vertically, or simultaneously across space. The text often emphasizes speed and inevitability rather than form. These details suggest that ancient authors struggled to express experiences that exceeded ordinary language, resulting in imagery that feels abstract, mechanical, or even disorienting. The terror produced by these figures is not rooted in hostility toward humanity, but in indifference to it. Angels do not react to human suffering unless commanded to do so. When mercy appears, it is procedural rather than emotional. This detachment reflects a worldview in which divine order supersedes individual experience, and angelic beings function as its impersonal instruments. Such portrayals challenge later assumptions that angels serve primarily as protectors or companions. In the prophetic texts, Protection is conditional and rare. Far more common is enforcement. Angels mark, separate, measure, and destroy. Their presence signals that events are unfolding according to a scale far larger than human survival. This development marks a turning point in biblical angelology. Fear is no longer merely a reaction to surprise, but to comprehension. The terrifying realization is not simply that angels exist, but that they operate constantly, systematically, and without regard for human expectations. The most unsettling angelic portrayals emerge within visionary literature, where language is stretched to its limits in an attempt to describe encounters that defy human categories. These texts do not present angels as distorted humans, but as beings whose forms actively resist familiar geometry, symmetry, and proportion. Terror arises not from aggression, but from incomprehensibility. Prophetic visions describe figures with multiple faces, intersecting wings, and bodies engulfed in fire or light. Eyes appear where eyes should not exist. Movement occurs without turning. Sound precedes sight. These descriptions are not ornamental. They reflect an ancient understanding that proximity to the divine produces forms that cannot be safely perceived in their entirety. Such imagery should not be read as metaphor in the modern sense. Ancient audiences did not separate symbolic vision from reality as sharply as later interpreters would. To them, these descriptions conveyed genuine encounters filtered through limited human perception. The fear expressed by the witnesses stems from the breakdown of sensory and cognitive stability. Fire, in particular, dominates these portrayals. It is not merely a visual element, but a boundary marker, signaling danger, purity, and power simultaneously. Angels associated with fire do not burn randomly. They radiate an intensity that defines what may approach and what must remain distant. Fire becomes a visual language of exclusion. The repeated emphasis on wings, eyes, and wheels reflects a worldview in which perception, motion, and awareness were understood as divine attributes. By assigning these features in overwhelming excess, the texts suggest beings whose capacity to see, act, and execute exceeds human limits exponentially. Terror emerges from recognizing that nothing is hidden from such entities. Notably, these visions often include a command for the human witness to remain silent or still. Speech fails. Movement is forbidden. The proper response is submission, not inquiry. The angelic presence does not invite understanding. It enforces recognition of hierarchy. Later artistic traditions softened these images, reducing complexity to preserve approachability. In doing so, they obscured the original function of such descriptions. These angels were not meant to be admired. They were meant to mark the boundary between the human and the divine, an edge defined by fear, awe, and irreversible distance. Beyond the canonical texts, Jewish literature of the Second Temple period expands angelic roles in ways that intensify their terrifying nature. These writings emerge from eras marked by exile, occupation, and perceived cosmic disorder, and they reflect an urgent need to explain how divine justice operates when history appears chaotic. Angels in these texts are no longer occasional visitors, but permanent regulators of a fragile universe. Apocryphal works describe angels assigned to govern natural forces, cosmic boundaries, and punishment in the afterlife. Their authority extends beyond human history into the structure of creation itself. Mountains, stars, winds, and deep places are depicted as territories under angelic supervision, reinforcing the idea that the world is enclosed within layers of unseen control. Particularly unsettling are descriptions of angels tasked with imprisonment and torment. These beings are not portrayed as cruel, but as precise. They measure time, assign duration, and enforce limits without deviation. Punishment is not emotional retaliation. It is administered as a function of cosmic order. The terror lies in its predictability. These texts also introduce angels as custodians of thresholds, gates of heaven, entrances to the underworld, and borders between realms. Humans who cross these boundaries without authorization are not warned or guided. They are stopped. The angel does not argue. It blocks, binds, or removes. A recurring theme is the angelic role in containing chaos. Dangerous knowledge, rebellious beings, and unstable forces are confined under angelic watch. The implication is clear. The universe persists not through harmony, but through restraint. Angels are the restraints. This framework reshapes fear itself. Terror is no longer tied to the unexpected appearance of an angel, but to the awareness that such beings are always present, maintaining balance through force if necessary. Human life unfolds under constant surveillance by entities whose mandate is order, not compassion. These developments influenced later Jewish and early Christian thought, though often indirectly. As theological emphasis shifted toward mercy and redemption, the most severe angelic functions were de-emphasized or reassigned. Yet the texts preserve them, offering a glimpse into a tradition where angels were feared because they ensured that nothing, human or cosmic, could escape judgment. Among the most disturbing angelic roles preserved in ancient literature is that of the guardian of forbidden knowledge. These angels are not destroyers in the conventional sense, yet their function provokes a deeper, more existential fear. They stand at the boundary between what humanity may know and what must remain inaccessible. In several Second Temple and early interpretive traditions, angels are depicted as custodians of divine secrets, calendrical systems, cosmic laws, names of power, and structures of the heavens. Knowledge itself is treated as dangerous substance. The angel's task is not to teach, but to prevent contamination. Unauthorized access threatens not merely individuals, but the stability of creation. These guardians are not persuaded by curiosity, righteousness, or intent. They respond only to mandate. This absolutism strips knowledge of moral framing and replaces it with jurisdiction. Certain truths are forbidden not because they are evil, but because humanity is not structurally capable of bearing them. The terror lies in the implication that ignorance is enforced for survival. Angels assigned to this role are often described as immovable and watchful. They do not patrol, they remain. Their presence defines a limit that cannot be crossed through effort, intelligence, or devotion. This creates a sharp contrast with later traditions that frame spiritual growth as ascent. In these texts, ascent without authorization results in annihilation or binding. Silence again plays a central role. Humans who encounter these beings are not instructed. They are halted. Speech is unnecessary when the outcome is predetermined. The angel's body becomes the law, occupying space in such a way that passage is no longer possible. This portrayal reflects an ancient fear, not of punishment, but of exposure. To see too much, to understand too fully, is to risk dissolution. Angels who guard knowledge embody this danger. They are terrifying not because they threaten harm, but because they confirm that there are truths humanity was never meant to reach. As theological traditions evolved, these angels were gradually reframed as teachers or guides. Yet the earlier texts resist this transformation. They preserve a vision of the cosmos in which divine truth is not universally accessible, and where angels exist to enforce that exclusion with unyielding precision. The terror associated with angels is often conveyed not through acts of overt violence, but through atmosphere, silence, scale, and sudden presence. Ancient texts repeatedly emphasize that angelic encounters overwhelm the human nervous system before any action is taken. Fear arises prior to understanding, suggesting that terror is an intrinsic effect of proximity rather than a response to threat. Angels frequently appear without transition. There is no preparation, no gradual revelation. One moment the world is stable, the next it is irrevocably altered. This abruptness destabilizes perception itself. The human mind, conditioned to continuity, is forced to confront a reality that does not obey ordinary temporal or spatial rules. Scale plays a critical role. Angelic beings are often described as filling spaces, doorways, horizons, temples, without clear boundaries. They are not contained by architecture or landscape. Their presence redefines space rather than occupying it. This produces a form of fear rooted in disorientation, where familiar reference points lose meaning. Sound, when mentioned, intensifies this effect. Voices resemble thunder, rushing waters, or overwhelming vibration rather than speech. Communication becomes environmental rather than conversational. The angel does not address an individual, it announces reality. Humans are reduced from participants to witnesses. Importantly, these texts rarely describe angels reacting to human fear. There is no attempt to reassure unless collapse or death would interfere with the execution of command. When reassurance appears, it is functional, not compassionate. Fear itself is not corrected, because it is appropriate. This pattern reveals a crucial insight into ancient theology. Terror was not viewed as incompatible with the divine. Awe and fear were expected responses to proximity with higher order. Angels, as intermediaries, carried this effect with them. Their presence confirmed that the boundary between humanity and the divine was not symbolic, but physiological and psychological. Later traditions often reinterpreted fear as misunderstanding. The earliest texts do not. They present terror as accurate perception, the mind recognizing its limits when confronted with something fundamentally other. In this sense, angels are terrifying not because they harm, but because they reveal how little of reality is structured for human endurance. As Jewish and early Christian theology developed, interpreters faced a growing tension between these terrifying angelic portrayals and emerging ideals of divine benevolence. Angels could not easily be reconciled as instruments of mercy when the texts consistently depicted them as agents of fear, enforcement, and exclusion. The response was not to erase these traditions, but to reinterpret them. One strategy was selective emphasis. Later writings focused increasingly on named angels associated with guidance, healing, or protection, while the more disturbing figures were pushed to the margins of interpretation. The hierarchy remained, but its most severe functions were reframed as distant or symbolic. Terror was relocated from lived experience to abstract theology. Another strategy involved moralization. Angels, once described as neutral executors of order, were reimagined as defenders of the righteous against evil forces. This shift introduced a clearer ethical polarity that was largely absent from earlier texts. In doing so, it softened the existential fear that arose from confronting a being indifferent to human suffering. Yet traces of the older tradition persisted. Liturgical language, visionary texts, and early commentaries continued to acknowledge angels, whose presence destabilized rather than comforted. Fear was no longer emphasized publicly, but it was never fully denied. The memory of terror remained embedded in the structure of angelic hierarchies and in the caution surrounding divine proximity. This interpretive evolution reveals less about angels themselves than about changing human needs. As communities sought hope amid uncertainty, the divine was increasingly portrayed as accessible and reassuring. Angels, as intermediaries, were adapted accordingly. What was lost in this process was not accuracy, but scale. The earlier texts insist that angels were never meant to be approachable. They existed to preserve distance, not intimacy. Later traditions did not eliminate this function. They simply learned to look away from it. The terror remained in the sources, waiting to be rediscovered by readers willing to confront the full weight of the ancient worldview. When the biblical descriptions of terrifying angels are placed alongside archaeological evidence and comparative mythology, their severity appears less anomalous and more culturally coherent. Ancient Near Eastern societies consistently envisioned the divine realm as populated by formidable enforcers rather than benevolent companions. Reliefs, inscriptions, and ritual texts from neighboring cultures depict hybrid beings, winged guardians, flame-bearing sentinels, and many-eyed watchers, stationed at temples, thrones, and cosmic thresholds. These figures were not worshipped for comfort. They were feared as protectors of order. Their function was to deter intrusion, enforce sacred boundaries, and signal the presence of power beyond negotiation. Biblical angelology shares this conceptual framework, though it reorients authority toward a single sovereign deity rather than a pantheon. Angels, in this context, inherit the terrifying aspects of older guardian figures, while losing independent divinity. Linguistic parallels reinforce this connection. Terms used to describe angelic beings often overlap with language of watchfulness, burning, standing, and guarding found across the region. These words emphasize posture and function over personality. The angel is defined by what it does, not who it is. Terror emerges naturally from such depictions, because function leaves no room for empathy. This comparative lens also clarifies why angels are frequently associated with thresholds, gates, doorways, borders, and horizons. In ancient thought, boundaries were the most dangerous spaces. They marked transitions between order and chaos, known and unknown. Guardians placed at these points were expected to be frightening. Fear was not a flaw in their design, but a feature. By preserving these motifs, the biblical texts maintain continuity with a worldview in which the sacred was inherently hazardous. To approach it was to risk dissolution, judgment, or transformation. Angels embodied that risk. They were visible reminders that the universe was structured, defended, and indifferent to human comfort. Understanding this background strips away later sentimentalism and restores the original force of the texts. The terror associated with angels was not the product of primitive imagination, but a logical outcome of how ancient cultures understood power, holiness, and survival. When the biblical and extra-biblical evidence is examined without the softening influence of later tradition, a consistent conclusion emerges. Angels were never designed to be familiar, comforting, or emotionally supportive. They were manifestations of divine order at its most unmediated, beings whose presence exposed the fragility of human existence rather than reassuring it. Across canonical scripture, apocrypha, and related ancient literature, terror is not an anomaly, but a defining feature of angelic encounters. Fear signals accuracy of perception. It marks the moment when human limitations become undeniable. Angels do not provoke terror because they are hostile, but because they operate on a scale where human concerns cease to matter. Their forms defy geometry, their movements ignore physical constraint, and their functions leave no room for negotiation. Whether executing judgment, guarding forbidden knowledge, or maintaining cosmic boundaries, angels embody inevitability. Once they appear, events unfold according to decree, not desire. Later religious traditions reshaped these beings to meet pastoral and devotional needs, emphasizing guidance over enforcement and intimacy over distance. Yet the original texts remain. They preserve a worldview in which the sacred was not safe, and proximity to divine power was inherently destabilizing. The most terrifying angels in the Bible are therefore not monsters, nor fallen beings, nor instruments of cruelty. They are something more unsettling. They are reminders that the divine, as understood by the ancient world, was never meant to be approached casually, and that fear was not a misunderstanding, but the correct response.